The page is thin, almost translucent, the kind of paper that was never meant to survive centuries. Yet, it did. It lies inside a leather-bound ledger in Toledo, inked by a notary whose job was to record facts, not fantasies. Except what he writes feels like something pulled from the future and dragged backward into the year 1584. Subject's pupils. At rest, when presented with host. Insufficient dilation. He is not describing a fever. He is not describing a wound. He is measuring a woman's eyes during communion, watching the tiny dark circles of her pupils as she looks at the cross, as if the diameter of her gaze can reveal the shape of her soul. You can almost picture the scene. The church air thick with wax and incense, the hush of bodies kneeling, the priest raising the host, and somewhere in the side aisle, a man with ink-stained fingers counting millimeters like a butcher estimating weight. The sentence is short. The implication is endless. Her name, at least the name that enters the archive, is Isabelle Deorda. She is in her 30s when she becomes a subject instead of a person. And within less than 2 years, men will cite the size of her pupils as proof that she should burn. That is the detail that makes this story feel unreal. Not that an institution tortured, not that it forced confessions, not that it executed the condemned in public. We already know those horrors. What makes your stomach tighten is the methodical calm of measurement, pulse rates, tear production, blink counts during prayer, perspiration when asked certain questions, a science of suspicion, dressed in robes and sanctified by ritual, determined to find guilt not in actions, but in involuntary reflex. The Inquisition did not only want your words, it wanted your body to testify against you, and it wanted you to believe, deeply, that your flesh could betray what your mouth refused to admit. And here is where the story becomes more disturbing than the cliches. By the time Isabelle's name enters those pages, this practice is not new. It has already been refined, revised, and codified for generations. There are manuals, thick, practical, bureaucratic manuals dedicated to what a woman's body will reveal when her words will not. There are checklists for grief. There are expectations for trembling. There are instructions for how to create conditions where fear does not explode too quickly, because terror ruins the data. If you have ever wondered what institutions do when they stop looking for truth and start manufacturing it, you are in the right place. This is Crimson Historians. We find the documents they buried, and what happened to Isabelle was not unique. It happened, in one form or another, to tens of thousands of women who learned too late that the tribunal was not judging belief. It was building a machine that made belief impossible to prove. Spain, 1478. The Inquisition begins. Most people think they know the outline. Heretics hunted, converts suspected, Jews forced to adopt Christianity or flee, confession torn from bodies by torture, the rack, the flames, the screams. All of that is real, and it is documented. But that familiar image hides a quieter truth that is harder to stomach. The Inquisition spent far more time watching than it did burning. In the decades when the institution was consolidating power, the number of interrogations dwarfed the number of executions. Thousands died, yes, but tens of thousands passed through tribunals and walked out alive, carrying something worse than scars, the knowledge that they had been studied. Between the early peak years, the tribunal system processed enormous numbers, and a significant portion were released without execution. That means hours and days and months were spent on something other than killing. So what were they doing with all that time? The answer sits in archives across Spain, in Valladolid, in Seville, in cold rooms where ledgers outlive the people who tried to disappear inside them. These are not confession transcripts. They are observation logs. Dry hands when touching crucifix, failed tears during the Passion, sweating when asked about Friday candles, page after page, woman after woman, reduced to a set of measurable reactions. The tribunal was not merely prosecuting heresy. It was compiling a catalog of the body under pressure, mapping physiology to suspicion. And it had one population it practiced on obsessively: women. Not because women were more likely to commit heresy, but because the institution believed women's bodies would reveal it more clearly, more honestly than men's. A belief as old as superstition and as convenient as a weapon. By the middle decades of the 16th century, the share of tribunal cases involving women swelled. Some regions saw women comprising a majority of those brought before inquisitors. The logic was always the same. Women were considered more emotionally volatile, more impressionable, more physically expressive, therefore more readable. Their tears could be graded. Their trembling could be timed. Their silence could be interpreted as concealment. Their composure could be interpreted as calculation. In that world, the female body was not simply a body. It was a text the institution claimed it could read. And when an institution announces it can read you better than you can speak for yourself, it stops needing proof. It only needs procedure. Isabelle's door opens on a Tuesday. Not with splintering wood, not with shouting, but with the controlled politeness of authority that does not need to raise its voice. Two men, familiarists, officers who serve the tribunal, stand with a rolled parchment sealed in wax. They do not tell her what she is accused of. That comes later. First, they take her to what they call the audience chamber. The name is almost comical in its blandness. It is not a dungeon, not a torture room. It looks bureaucratic. A table, 3 chairs, a crucifix on the wall, a window with iron bars that still allow sunlight to fall across the floor. The ordinariness is not accidental. It is design. The Inquisition's training culture understood something that modern interrogation rooms still exploit. Panic is loud, but composure is revealing. Terrified people confess to anything. Calm people provide patterns. So, Isabelle sits. Hours pass before anyone speaks. 2 notaries watch from behind a wooden screen, the kind used to create distance without leaving the room. She has not confessed. She has not denied. She has barely said a word. Yet the pens move. Subject shifts position every. Subject touches face. Breathing rate increases when footsteps approach door. The tribunal is not interrogating her. It is cataloging her. Every movement becomes data. Every reflex becomes potential evidence. The longer she sits, the more she becomes something like an insect pinned under glass, not for curiosity, but for classification. And somewhere in those first hours, before she understands the rules, Isabelle fails tests she does not know exist. Not tests of doctrine, tests of biology. Because the tribunal does not need you to say you are guilty if it can convince itself that your body looks guilty. The nightmare is that the standards are invisible and shifting. She cannot ask what the test is, because to ask would be to reveal fear. She cannot relax, because relaxation can be interpreted as lack of remorse. She cannot tremble too much, because excess can be interpreted as performance. She is trapped inside a room where the air itself feels like measurement, where even silence is observed, where the only safe posture is one that does not exist. To understand why Isabelle's pupils mattered to men with authority, you have to understand what the institution believed about the human body. In the late 15th century, 2 inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, helped popularize a text that would poison Europe's imagination. The witch-hunting manual known as the Hammer of Witches. It is remembered as a guide to detecting sorcery, but inside its obsession is a broader assumption. Evil leaves marks, not metaphorical marks. Physical marks. The body, they argued, responds differently when touched by corruption. The flesh, they insisted, cannot fully hide what the soul contains. That belief was not science, but it wore the costume of science, categories, rules, procedures, and the seductive promise that uncertainty could be eliminated by method. The Inquisition, facing the problem of hidden belief, converts suspected of practicing Judaism in secret, took that logic and applied it to Christianity itself. They theorized that genuine conversion would be physiological, that a person who truly accepted Christ would show measurable responses during ritual, tears that come easily during Mass, a pulse that quickens before the Eucharist, pupils that dilate at the sight of the Virgin, tremors when kissing the cross, perspiration when reciting certain prayers. And if those responses did not appear, the body was remembering another faith. This is where the cruelty becomes almost surreal. They treated involuntary reflex as proof of belief, as if the nervous system were a confession machine. By the 16th century, tribunals employed physicians not to heal, but to measure. Tools appear in inventories: calipers for pupil diameter, water clocks for timing pulse, graduated vials for collecting tears. In Seville, there were efforts to validate the method by comparing known converts with old Christians. And even when those comparisons produced no consistent differences, when the data refused to cooperate, the institution did not abandon the approach. It adjusted the interpretation. If measurement did not reveal guilt, then guilt could be defined as failure to match expectation, and expectation could be defined by whoever held the pen. That is how pseudoscience becomes power. It does not need to work in order to control. It only needs to be believed. When the Inquisitor finally enters Isabelle's room, it is after hunger and sleeplessness have softened her edges. He has a name in the record, Alonso de Mendoza, and decades of experience. He carries a wooden case, compact, like something meant for prayer. He does not sit across from her like a judge. He sits beside her, close enough to invade her space without touching her, close enough that she can smell ink on cloth, the faint sourness of old paper. The questions begin, and they are not about Judaism. Not at first. Describe your wedding night. The question strikes like a slap because it is intimate, humiliating, and confusing. What does a marriage bed have to do with faith? Mendoza opens the wooden case. Inside, a vial, a thin brass rod with markings, and a small mirror. The object is not merely to ask, it is to watch her body while she answers. Did you feel joy? Did you weep? He notes the absence of tears. He shifts to childbirth, which saint she invoked, whether she prayed, whether she felt ecstasy, his word, when her child first breathed. Isabelle tries to guess the correct response, but there is no correct response because the words are not the point. The notary behind the screen times her pulse with a water clock, counting beats by the drip of water between chambers. The tribunal is measuring her physiology as if belief has a heart rate. Then Mendoza holds up the mirror, a small rectangle of glass, and asks her to look at the crucifix while he watches her reflection. The notation appears later with brutal simplicity. Pupils constricted, expected dilation absent. Expected by whom? Based on what? The record does not cite evidence, it cites authority. And Isabelle, like so many converso families, likely knows the folklore of survival. Cry during communion. Let your hands shake when you kiss the cross. Practice pupil dilation by staring at candlelight. Imagine the tragedy of that women training their own bodies for decades, practicing devotion as choreography, not because they want to deceive God, but because they want to survive men who claim to speak for him. And even then, it is not enough. Because there is a cruel paradox built into the system. If you perform the responses too well, they can accuse you of performance. If you perform them poorly, they can accuse you of concealment. The institution does not want proof of belief. It wants leverage. It wants you to live inside a permanent audition, where every breath might be graded, where authenticity becomes a liability, and the safest self is the one you can no longer access. After long hours, Isabelle is moved to a cell that is not yet a dungeon, but it is still confinement. a narrow room, a straw mattress, one candle, a bucket, and another woman. The record gives her a name, Maria Enriquez. She appears sympathetic, kind, exhausted, familiar with the rhythms of fear. She tells Isabelle she has been held for weeks on accusations of prohibited reading. She seems like a lifeline, another human being in a world designed to isolate. And that is exactly the point. Because the Inquisition's manuals contain a section for this too, hidden witnesses, placed when observation alone fails. A cooperative ear in the cell, instructed to befriend the accused, to draw out conversation, to exchange comfort for confession, and then to deliver that confession to the tribunal in exchange for leniency. Sometimes the ears were real prisoners bargaining for freedom. Sometimes they were employees trained to play the role. In either case, they were weapons shaped like companions. Maria asks gentle questions. What was your life like before this? Do you have children? Are you afraid? Isabelle, starved for kindness, begins to speak. She talks about her daughter. She talks about her husband, dead for years. She mentions candles on Friday. She insists it is for cleaning, for habit, for ordinary life. Behind the wall, the notary writes it down. Days later, Isabelle will be confronted with a transcript of what she said, including lines she does not remember, including lines she swears she never spoke. And she will have no way to prove the difference between her memory and their ink. In a world that worships documents, the written record becomes more real than the woman standing in front of it. But the method goes deeper than entrapment. Maria does not only extract words, she performs devotion. At night, when the candle burns low, she prays loudly, trembling, tears streaming, clutching a rosary the tribunal has allowed her to keep. She weeps with an intensity that feels like theater, because it is. She is demonstrating what genuine Christianity is supposed to look like. She is setting a standard Isabelle's body will be judged against. So Isabelle tries to match it. She prays. She forces tears. She makes her hands shake. And, somewhere in another ledger, the notary notes, tears inconsistent. Ceased abruptly when cellmate stopped. Physiological response suggests performance rather than devotion. Isabelle is not only being watched, she is being trained into a trap where every attempt to survive becomes more evidence that she is calculating. On the seventh day, Isabelle confesses. She admits to Friday candles. She admits to avoiding pork. She admits to a blessing learned from her grandmother. She admits to a cloth stitched with Hebrew letters hidden in a trunk. The inquisitors record it all, ask for details, quantify the practice. How many Fridays? Which prayers? Where did she get the cloth? Isabelle cries, this time not performed, but real. She believes confession will lead to reconciliation, public penance, the shame of a penitential garment, perhaps the humiliating procession. But life, she imagines returning to her daughter, carrying disgrace but still breathing. Mendoza closes the ledger, thanks her, and tells her she will be moved, while preparations are made for her reconciliation ceremony. The scene reads like mercy. It is not. After she leaves, Mendoza writes a sentence that appears in thousands of cases. The confession exhibits physiological inconsistency. That is the pivot. The tribunal does not judge only what you confess. It judges how your body behaves while confessing. There are manuals that describe the truly repentant as if repentance has a standardized symptom list. Copious tears, trembling beginning in the hands and spreading to the torso, difficulty breathing, faintness when contemplating sin. Those who confess from calculation are expected to show muted or controlled responses. Do you see the cruelty? You can confess everything, and it still may not count. Because the institution can always claim your tears were insufficient, your trembling too contained, your voice too steady. Grief becomes a performance you cannot win. And Isabelle almost certainly knows this. By her time, converso families warn each other. Practice your confession. Make it physical. Hyperventilate. Collapse. Let your body look like it is being destroyed by remorse. But the institution anticipates that too. Notaries record when distress appears excessive and therefore rehearsed. Too little grief. Guilty. Too much grief. Guilty. The right amount of grief. A moving target that shifts with tribunal, inquisitor, and the private biases of the men writing the ledger. The system is designed so innocence cannot be proven. That is not a flaw. It is the point. So when the story reaches its public climax, Isabelle condemned, processed to the plaza. Crimes read aloud, the final charge is not only candles or prayers, it is the failure of her body to display adequate signs of divine grace. Imagine being executed not because of what you did, but because your pupils did not widen at the right moment. Your tears did not flow in the correct quantity. Your trembling did not spread to the correct muscles. Your body failed the test, so your body burns. Decades and centuries pass, and the ledgers accumulate. And in the margins, those private scribbles that reveal what official ink tries to hide there are admissions, notes that say, in essence, we tested this, it does not work. No correlation between pupil dilation and truth. Old Christians and conversos show identical ranges of responses. Physiological detection cannot distinguish belief. The method lacks foundation. Continue pending an alternative procedure. That is the part that changes everything. They knew. They knew the flesh did not differentiate what the soul contained. They knew their instruments detected nothing reliable, and they kept using them for generations. Not out of ignorance, out of utility. Because then comes the most revealing margin note of all. The method's value lies not in accuracy of detection, but in efficacy of control. When subjects believe their bodies can betray them, they police themselves. That sentence is the blueprint of a modern world. You do not need to watch everyone all the time. You only need to convince everyone they might be watched and convince them the evidence will come from inside their own skin. When a person fears their own nervous system, they become compliant without chains. They regulate their tears. They regulate their trembling. They regulate their breathing. They bury authenticity because authenticity becomes dangerous. The Inquisition did not only punish, it trained a population to perform permanent self-surveillance, and the method does not remain in Spain. The logic mutates and reappears. Drowning tests in witch trials, bodily marks sought as proof of guilt, racial pseudoscience measuring skulls, modern devices that claim to detect deception through heart rate and sweat and breath. Each iteration claims to be objective. Each iteration accumulates data. Each iteration ends up targeting whoever power wants to control. The pattern is older than any single tribunal. You do not need to prove guilt if you can build a world where innocence is unprovable, where the body becomes evidence of its own corruption, where fear turns inward until the victim becomes their own jailer. Isabelle's file ends the way so many do. Relinquished to the secular arm, legal language that pretends the church does not kill, even as it hands bodies over to be burned. The record notes the offer of mercy, a strangling before fire, if she confesses properly at the stake. Even there, even at the edge of flame, a notary watches, and if her voice is steady, if her eyes are dry, if her trembling is insufficient, mercy is denied. The system does not only kill, it grades suffering. It demands performance until the last breath, and then it uses the failure of that performance as justification for cruelty. That is what it did to accused women. It was designed to break them not only by pain, but by the endless demand that their flesh testify correctly. If this story made you understand something about how power operates when it stops looking for truth and starts manufacturing compliance, subscribe to Crimson Historians. We find the documents they buried. we resurrect the voices they tried to silence. Because the moment we forget how this was done, how bodies were turned into testimony, how fear was engineered into self-policing, that is the moment someone tries it again.
Where did you hide the relics? Tell me now.